Welcome to Agronomy Moment. I'm your host, Wendell Cohen. We bring in people who agree with me, disagree with me, and above all, are not afraid to say it like it is.
Now, if you try to flip on that, that looks more gooder. I thought you did. Looks great to me. It's gooder.
It does look gooder.
So I should never have brought up
you
that
have bloopers.
grammar is my pet peeve
Mm-hmm.
in using incorrect grammar, because now everyone's going to extract as much mileage as they can out of it.
You betcha.
Welcome to this podcast. I'm excited to have Alex along with us. You've traveled, made a long journey for what, 3 hours? Something like that. And is joining us today because what we're interested in talking about is some questions I've gotten over this last year regarding not necessarily how the herbicide works or exactly what it is, but some of the effects and the results that we get when we apply herbicide. Such as things if we get too much and things like that. So I'm going to dive in to the first section of this video, which is over-application of the herbicide. If we go above label and beyond, some of the negative impacts it can have, as well as maybe some non-effects that we might be worried about. And one of the first ones I'm going to talk about is this question of, there's some chemistries like foamosaphin, for example, is kind of a burner, right?
Mm-hmm. We
apply it to the soil or to the ground, and then we say we can't plant corn for 10 months or whatever the date is.
Right.
Well, I mean, why is it? Because I got weeds.
So, like we talked about, it's a crop sensitivity issue, right? So,
Okay.
like you have a herbicide, it'll be developed to target a specific weed, right? It still impacts every plant that it touches. It just has a, lesser or more impact to the plant that it touches. So, for example, you take like 2,4-D dicamba, right? Has no impact on grasses.
Yes.
Until we get into the germination of grass plants like corn. So dicamba, for example, has basically, a month rotation, 2-week rotation interval to planting corn.
That's because of its emergence.
Yeah. And then you look at 2,4-D is the same way. It'll be 7 to 14 days depending on product and all that kind of stuff. So back to your example of fomesipin there.
I didn't say it right.
So
that's why he's smart.
Yeah, it is exactly why he's smart.
He was something wrong.
Yeah, so the PPO chemistry, and I'm not going to get into the chemistry of it because I don't even understand all the chemistry of it. You look at the crop sensitivities of stuff. Soybeans, not hardly sensitive to it at all. So you look at the PPOs as a band of products. And it varies on what they are, but they're different active ingredients that fall within that PPO category, right? So we know that some of the stouter pre-emerge intended PPOs, like your authorities, your valors, things like that, will have an impact on soybean emergence, right?
Okay.
We've all seen that.
Yeah.
Then you have some other ones like the cadets, the reflexes or your fomesipins, things like that. They don't have a lot of impact on soybean emergence, but obviously they do have some impact on corn and other grass species, right? Now you take that out farther, some of those pre-emerge PPOs.
Further.
What's that?
Further.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Farther.
Yeah. But anyway, you look at the bigger picture of that is that some of those pre-emergent PPOs will have less of an impact from a post standpoint versus like the cadets and the fomesipins that have a bigger impact from a post standpoint. Now that was kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, is that it all just depends on the crop and the chemical. Right, because some will have a very long rotation interval, like you mentioned, of 10 months or more. You start looking at some other crops like cotton, and those get extended out to 18 months or even farther. So it all just comes down to sensitivity and the chemical itself.
Got it. Now let's go to Roundup and Liberty, glufosinate, glyphosate, and we've got what happens when we go too high above labeled rates. And I'm talking about a fair amount more. Sometimes in crop we can see a response, flash or something.
Yep.
So, but what happens as far as plant back or anything with something like that?
So as far as I know, just a good qualifier there to throw in for an agronomist. There'd be no amount of glyphosate or no reasonable amount of glyphosate or glufosinate you could spray to cause any kind of plant back restriction to any crop, as far as I'm aware.
Sure.
Especially to a traded crop that's tolerant of said chemistries, and that it comes back to the chemistry thing with how that chemical interacts with what it touches. Sure. Right. So it lands on a plant, gets through the cuticle on the plant, gets in the tissue, does its job. Hits soil, maybe it's because of the chemistry of the soil makes those chemicals in there no longer effective, so they don't impact anything from then on.
Got it. Okay. So, with that being said, I'm not advocating above label rates, but I'm just throwing that out there as, what's going on, because that has been a question that's been asked, and concerned with maybe it's damaging soil or, long-term.
Yeah.
Negative effects.
I think one of the things, because what you're saying is valid, I think one of the questions that gets missed more often than not is how much time do we need to allow after an application?
Absolutely.
Right? So I mentioned the 240 dicamba, and I know I mentioned a week or two on 240 going to corn.
Yes.
I would argue or venture to guess that most of your customers and farmers in general would say, oh, you can spray 240 2 days before you plant corn, no issues, whatever. It's not an issue until it is. Right.
Yes.
You get the right weather conditions, right soil conditions, and then you can solve the problem. So that's right. I think taking those pre-plant intervals seriously, paying attention to what's going on, because there's all sorts of stuff that can cause serious problems for long term. I mentioned graze on earlier today when we were having a conversation.
Absolutely.
If you're not paying attention to that type of stuff, it can cause a real issue.
Got it. So if you were, for example, thought you were going to run cattle on a certain piece of ground for a long period of time, and then you spray graze on it, and a year later you're like, hey, we want to go to corn here. Now we're going to spray this, burn this down, and turn this into crop. You need to look at the graze on label. So exactly. If you'd used it to apply to your buckbrush and all that kind of thing, understand what you did. So let's dive into taking this a step further and look into chemistries in general as it relates to residue, bare dirt. And the thing that I've felt like I've noticed in the past is when we spray living cover crop, I feel like the residual gets tied up in the living green matter. And I thought maybe that was the issue. But talk to us a little bit about, we're going to eventually get to the strategies of what we might do if you have cover crop. But for right now, talk about bare dirt versus residue.
So I think on a basic level, a pre-emergent herbicide is meant to be taken up through a root, or some part of the plant that's below ground.
Yep.
And so that means it has to be in soil.
Okay.
So if you're applying it to a standing cover crop or the residue of a burned down cover crop, you may be interfering with that soil application, right? And I think beyond that, there is an argument to be made that a dead piece of organic matter may have that chemical on top of it, not breaking down. Say it doesn't photodegrade or something like that. It's just sitting on top of that residue. Eventually that will wash into the soil and be taken up by a plant, whereas sprayed on a living plant may be taken up into the plant and therefore metabolized by the plant and no longer the chemical that it was when you applied it. Now, what I will say is that you look at spraying a pre-emergent herbicide on bare ground, so cultivated ground, just bare ground, nothing growing on it.
Yes.
Consider that 100% chance that it could be taken up by the weed that you wanted to take.
Absolutely.
Whereas you move into the burn down or the dead residue of a previous crop or a cover crop, call that a 60-70% chance. These are just numbers that I'm making up.
Absolutely.
Right? It's just not 100%.
Yes.
And then you get in a living crop, and maybe that gets less, maybe it's about the same. Right. Yes. So the big reduction happens if you're not spraying on bare dirt, and then it kind of varies from there.
And so if you have high stover amounts, I'm just talking like corn stalks, for example, and applying, that's where there's going to be higher risks of breakthroughs, right? And I noticed that. You go out there in a heavy residue situation, you put your burn down, you thought you did it right, but then you get that little bit of water hemp starting to grow in little masses right around the edges of the peripheries of some of this.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair assumption to make. Yeah.
So, is there some way to overcome that, or the strategy?
Tillage.
Tillage.
Well, so it's kind of, worked with a weed science professor at one time, and he kind of set things up into different categories that you choose from, right? You have a moldboard plow, you've got vertical tillage, and conventional tillage with a field cultivator, something like that. Obviously, the moldboard plow is going to provide the highest amount of weed control, looking at it from that perspective, right? Because you're turning over, like water hue, for example, emerges from an inch below the soil surface. So if you turn that over, it can emerge. It's an effective weed control management system. You look at vertical till, doesn't move a lot of soil, basically none, right? Then you go into another category, and it'd be soybean or crop row width, right? 30 inches versus 15 inches. 15 inches canopies faster, provides less sunlight interaction, more weed control. Then you get into like the no-till, also being a part of the cultivation. So you can pick any of these things, and there's doing it the hard way, and they're just making your life easier for you, right? So if you're using a moldboard plow and 15-inch beans, for example, that is, you wouldn't have to spend as much money on herbicide.
Correct.
Right, because you have a better overall intrinsic weed control system. Now, if you use vertical till and 30-inch beans, you're probably going to have to spend a little more money on herbicides.
I see.
Just logically. So there's different combinations of things you can do. Whereas if you're no-till and 30-inch beans, that's probably the highest money spent on herbicides. Whereas you're again conventional or moldboard plow, conventional till, 15-inch beans, it's the lowest on the scale.
And so you're no-tilling into corn stalks, which is a common thing to do.
Yep.
Then one needs to consider possibly more spend on the herbicide budget.
Depends on how good of a job that residue is doing covering the ground.
Next question, though, right down that line, though, is I'm going back to the strategy thing. Is there anything one can do when you're running a sprayer over it gets more water? I mean, is there anything such thing as something you overcome residue? Really? I mean, it's the same thing.
A good rule of thumb is more water is always better.
Yes.
Like even for residual stuff, you're going to see better coverage with more water. So that is possible. I'm not going to guarantee.
Sure.
That, but that just as a way of thinking, always increase the gallonage and you're going to see better results. For the most part.
It'd be interesting, and I can tell there's not really data we're pulling from right now to say there is or isn't, but it'd be very interesting to know if there would ever be, like, and Selena chime in, if there would be any value if you went to 15 gallons for residual, just a residual application versus 12 or 10, if you would see a jump in efficacy of your residuals, on a no-till situation. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but
I'd say it'd be limited. I'd say some years, like if you just look at anecdotally, there's going to be a year you're like, man, that worked out really good, and then other years you're going to say, well, that didn't make any difference, just cost me more time. Right. Now, if you did nail it down, did the whole academic research approach and replicate it and all that, I'm guessing you could find a difference. If it's real practical, I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah. Any thoughts you have, Selena, to jump in on?
Couldn't have said it better.
I'm trying to think, anything else you want to add that comes to your mind as it relates to weed control?
I think the one thing that I always preach is spray stuff earlier than you think you should. I have a lot of conversations with guys, especially this time of year, looking at burn down, getting ready to start planting. The smaller stuff is easier to kill, and that just continues on through the season, right? Especially for post applications for your glufosinate, for your glyphosates, smaller weeds are infinitely easier to kill. Especially when you're talking about water hemp that basically doubles its growing points for every 2 inches of growth that it sees. Like that's
absolutely
gets substantially harder to kill. The other thing is time your applications or make your applications more timely. That's the other part of that conversation when we're trying to put a chemical program together for a guy, especially on soybeans, is that you really want to overlap those residuals. And that doesn't, as a basic idea or principle, any residual at the labeled rate is going to last for about 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
That's the time you're looking at. So you want to overlap that. So your application should really be in the 3 to 4 week post-application range, which sounds soon, but so if you're putting, say you're spraying your pre-emergent herbicides the day you planted it. 3 weeks later, whether the beans are up or not, or what the weeds look like, you need to be planning to make another application within that 21 to 28 day period.
And so you're saying to spray by the calendar.
Correct.
By the dates.
Yes.
Between dates.
Yep.
So, since we're talking about this whole thing, I'm going to ask the question if you have a couple of programs that you kind of like for chemical, or like active ingredients or families even. We're not trying to trumpet any brand of any sort.
I know what you're getting at. The nice thing is that there's a lot of good options at every price point. So not getting too nitpicky. There's the way I look at it is how much stand risk are you willing to take, and then name weed control. Because that's how I split up pre-emergent programs, right?
Yes.
So if you're going in with a heavy PPO, like your flumioxazins, your sulfentrazones, things like that, you're going to give up a little bit of stand, most likely, depending on weather conditions. But that's going to provide the longest residual and the best weed control, like water.
Yes.
Now, if that's something that you're very concerned about and that's something you want to avoid, you still have another option in going with a product like a metribuzin. Metribuzin and acetochlor is a fantastic combination, very, very limited crop response out of it, and you still get good enough weed control, but you may need to shift your post application up a little bit, just because the triazines aren't notoriously persistent anymore as far as water control.
So in that case, would you lean towards more like the 21 days or the 2 to 3 week, maybe 3 week time period? And if you had the PPOs, you could go maybe the 4 week. Lean that. I mean, we're not talking leaning large amounts of time here.
Right. Well, you're exactly right, and that's exactly what I would recommend. The other thing is when you're dealing with residuals, the rate is basically the equivalent to time.
Okay.
So if you're using a half rate or a setup rate, is what they're known, you could expect to shorten that time span. That 6 weeks cuts down. It doesn't get cut in half. It doesn't go to 3 weeks because you're dealing with like kind of a bell curve, so to speak, right? So you're up here and you're still controlling, and it's a pretty quick drop off at a certain point. So that being said, use higher rates. If you're not using higher rates, then you need to probably move that application up to the 21. Everything's going to work for 3 weeks, right? Unless you get a tremendous amount of rainfall, something goes wrong, soil types are wonky, pHs are wonky, something like that. The 3 weeks is 21 days is a good target. You can extend that a little bit. I would struggle to extend it much past 28 days just because you do want to overlap.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense.
I'll say, did that answer your question?
It does. Our original question, it did not, because we were in the middle of talking about the chemistry. So just real quick here, you were talking about the triazines. Now let's move on to.
So you go, we'll just call it PPO, not PPO, right? Post 21 days later, I'm going to come in with a group 15 because it's basically our only options. Group 15s would be your acetochlors, your metolachlors, your dimethenamids, blank on residual right now. Residual is another group.
It's a pyroxasulfate.
Yep, that is exactly right. So you come in with those at your 21 days again, and that's going to be ideally your rest of season water control, grass and water control, right? Anything that's up right then, you're going to throw in whatever you want to use, your Enlist or your Liberty, glyphosate, whatever. I mean, your post program wants to be. I don't really care. All of them work pretty equivalently in my opinion.
As long as you're aligned with your trait package.
Correct. So that's basically the program. In my opinion, you can do a 3-pass program however you want to cut it. You can save a bunch of money and do it all in season. The guys that do that, you can spend a little more up front, have your pre's, and do it with residuals in season.
Okay, so now I'm going to dive into something else that just came to my mind. What are we at? Do we have enough time?
There's 20. We're at 20 minutes.
Okay. Real quick, we've got to do this one.
Okay.
In the Enlist guys that are going Enlist, they have Enlist in their back pocket. Okay. Right now with Extend guys, we don't have dicamba.
Correct.
And so we have this period of time, and I'm going to ask you, this is a 2-part question.
Mm-hmm.
The one part is at what temperatures and humidities can we start spraying the glufosinate to take the pressure off on a dicamba situation or an Enlist? And what do we do in between for dicamba? Is it just a matter of the really strong residuals, or like using PPOs for a dicamba situation and risking the stand a little bit, or having a little bit of a stand reduction? Talk to us about that, helping us with dicamba this year.
Yeah. So from a post standpoint, altogether, because I think dicamba, the loss of the XtendFlex or the labeled XtendFlex products, I guess position it that way. From my perspective, the biggest loss was burn down. Right. In season, I don't see a lot of difference between a good Liberty and Roundup, like a glufosinate glyphosate combination versus an Extend. Right? It's just, I don't see that big of a difference in it. Now, everybody's got their story of it didn't work, and we can get into that in a minute, back to our other conversation there. The biggest loss for me is burn down. Mm-hmm. So, looking at replacing it from a burn down with no plant back restriction, I should clarify, because you can still use something like Clarity or some of those, but you're back to that label's restriction, right? Which is about 30 days after half-inch rain.
Yes.
Right, so it's a pretty tremendous lead time, especially when we're sitting here on March 11th or whatever it is, and it's looking to be in 80 degrees. I mean, if you want to go plant beans next week and you spray dicamba today, technically I'm letting you not allowed to.
Yeah.
So looking at it from that direction, then if you want a good, pretty much equivalent burn down application, especially for something like Maresdale, you're looking at adding in Sharpen to a 240 application.
Yep.
Then you get kind of the similar control. But 1-to-1, 240 just isn't the burn down chemical that dicamba is.
Right.
And you get in season, and I don't see that as much. I mean, you look at 240 glyphosate post application, it's pretty effective. Make sure you're paying attention to weed size and stuff.
But if you're a dicamba guy, what are you doing then?
Roundup and Liberty.
Roundup and Liberty.
Court to court.
Okay, so now we're talking about like in May, we can get some pretty cool weather.
Yep.
So is it a matter of talk about the conditions where Liberty has more likelihood to fail, and that is I feel like it has something to do with sometimes those cold or cool, cloudy days.
Mm-hmm. So
can we just choose one day we have a sunshine and it's 75? Are we good to go, or do we got to think more than that?
I think humidity plays a bigger part than anything. And this is one of those things where an actual weed scientist or biochemist could probably argue with me that you're right. But again, anecdotally, from what I've seen, humidity makes all the difference in the world.
Okay. Higher is better.
Higher is better.
Okay.
So we've talked for years about this magic number of 120 or 150 or whatever. You add relative humidity in the temperature, and you want that number to be above 120 or 150 or whatever. So your 75-degree day, you want pretty high humidity at 75%, 75 degrees, and sunshine to get to the control you want. Now, if you get into the summertime, though, and you start seeing like 80, 90-degree days, but you see, like, especially on drought years, you see the humidity drop, that's where you see the kills start to get a little worse. So that's where I base my whole humidity thing. I think early in the season like that, as long as if you're following the plan of the 21 days after planting, because you're talking about May, do try to identify that warmer day, move that application in the afternoon when stuff's actively growing. I think your Roundup's going to carry a lot of weight, for most of the weeds, and I think Liberty's just going to provide that extra oomph to knock out the rest of the water handle, I guess is what I'm focused on.
Okay, but is there a day that's too cool to spray? Is there a temperature that just fine? I don't care what the humidity is. It's too cool.
Yeah, I'd say below 70 degrees.
70,
and you're going to see.
Okay. So 70 is kind of your point. When you try to get your above 70.
Yeah, and I mean that's just ballparking and an estimated guess. But
you're trying to make sure the plants are growing well and doing good uptake when you're doing it, right? Because that's your only shot.
Yep.
And so I had another question, but I can't think what it was. And we need to probably wrap up here with this. I think we've covered a lot of ground. But I think the important thing is with this Liberty application, especially when you're in those May time frames, is doing what Alex talks about, is focusing on your conditions, weather conditions. And if it gets hotter, think you need humidity. Your 150 points might not always be your answer. At 90 degrees and 40% or 50% humidity, maybe think still 67. It's be nice to get higher humidities.
Yeah, and on those days, I mean, when we do get in the heat of summer like that, because we're talking about spraying Liberty in the heat of the afternoon, move those applications up to the morning.
In the morning.
Even in the past couple of drought years, we've had 22, 23, we still had relatively higher humidity first thing in the morning, while we also had those higher temperatures. It kind of goes away throughout the day. Once the wind picks up, things like that, humidity drops, the air temperature goes up. So you can move that around a little bit. Though one thing that I would say is avoid nighttime applications of Liberty. It seems like that does not work.
But I'm starting at maybe 9 through noon, running, when the dew is coming off and drying off. So, and then in the springtime, like you say, invert that. Go to the afternoons and do it the heat of the day.
And same thing, again, you bring up a good point, is that when we do hit that afternoon timing and the humidity is really low, a good indicator is when beans start flopping trifoliates over. You start seeing the lighter green colors. Just shut off all herbicide applications in general.
That makes
sense. Just because if your beans are stressed that much, and because that's what they're doing, is conserving water, right? That means they're not actually growing. The weeds are doing the same thing. They may be a little more tolerant to heat or whatever, but that's usually a pretty good indicator to shut the sprayer down, because your control, even on stuff like Enlist and Roundup, those combinations are going to struggle. On some easy to kill weeds, like your foxtails and stuff like that, will be harder to kill.
But again, we're trying to increase the chances of kill.
Yeah, exactly.
And so this is the way to do that.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much for watching. We have to go. See you next time.
The only thing, the weird thing about that is I 100% agree, and it's funny because when prices are high, we say we need to do this practice because prices are so high. When prices are low,
It's more
sometimes
important.
that little tiny incremental margin is your take-home pay.
That's one of the things Hannibal's going to hit. What's the cheap thing? What's a cheap thing we can do to make bigger differences?
Yes,
And
exactly.
planting date, you're going to plant.
Yes.
So,
I think
you know,
that's part of maybe what we're gonna do at part of our boost conversation.
yeah,
Maybe
should
driven
be.
a little bit
Yep.
from that. So
Well, I'm
it's
just
crazy.
saying that sometimes we ignore the low commodity price times, and I do, but then I stop and think about it, and
Might be what helps a guy get by.
it is. I was just looking on the farmer's budget, and I was like, some of those little things I started putting in there. It's like, that was about what I took on to feed my family. Had I not had that incremental change, then I would have done this.
It's
really
almost
impacts.
bean time.
So
I got splinters in my hand. I'm cutting. It's almost bean time.
lunch, yes.
Scott, all these things are
Well, it's
And-
11:30. It's 12 almost.
cameras.
No, it's not. Oh,
Don't get talking. Kind of get that kind of move over there like I was shutting it off. And I just kind of
Yeah, I got that splinter dissected out.